2022 is here, and we got to take full advantage of this so that we can move forward with full enthusiasm and, more importantly, momentum to continue building on the skills that we've acquired the past year, and more importantly, to make sure that we can articulate the lessons from the past year to ourselves and anybody who may be interested in learning from our past experiences, so that we can bring up new individuals to our current position. Because otherwise, if you don't bring up somebody to know the ways that you perceive are to be proper and proven to be true in the public's eyes, and more importantly in the public's heart, well, then you can't leave that position. You see, the entire thing here in this thing that we call life is being able to collect information through different fractals of experiences or minds, which collectively will unite to create or inspire new neurological connections. And that's essentially what we're doing here. By you taking the time to watch this type of content, you will hopefully inspire within your own brainwaves new type of neurological connections that will allow you to perceive the world differently. In other words, sparking up the light within your own mind that will allow you to make decisions in the future with either more awareness, more precision, or more structure. And that's all I'm here to do. I just like to speak from the heart whenever I address subjects like this, because it's more important that me and you have a relationship developed on the understanding of what has been accomplished thus far before proceeding forward to articulate where it is that we're going this year. Because today officially was the day that I launched my first smart contract. We have started the process of creating everything that I've been discussing. And obviously this is big momentum building information that I'm sharing with you, because as we proceed, not only will I be learning more about blockchain at the back end level, and I'll be sharing that with you, but first I have to educate you on why I chose to leave the health and fitness world, in the sense of no longer applying my entire time to that industry. And I've chosen to walk out of that industry to learn a brand new language, which is how to interact with computers, to take full ownership of the decisions, the parameters, the procedures, the code. Because in code I trust, and in code I can look back and depend on. And now with the technologies that we've created, I can essentially create everything that I need to do to create a self-governing ecosystem that is able to allow individuals to learn what it is that I consider the seed of a human being. And these are just three simple things: the way that we feed ourselves, the way that we move, and more importantly, the way that we invest or protect our resources. And so when I started to really focus on that last piece, investing and protecting my resources, I had to decide whether I was going to participate in the old financial system, which is the stock market, or if I was going to go ahead and take part of the new revolution, right? Which is the technological revolution, which is allowing us to tokenize our ideas, our communities, products, concepts, and services in order to be able to redistribute wealth under new parameters of what is monetary liquidity. And then all of a sudden, we have created what is called universal basic income. You see, the world is going through a transition right now where everybody's looking to understand what is the next big thing, but they're not really understanding what is building the next big thing. And that's really what I'm here to open your eyes to. Because in the past year, I've truly dedicated myself to understanding the infrastructure of crypto, not necessarily getting rich off of crypto. I have made significant gains that this year will be able to then put me in a better position to allocate my time and resources and attention to developing myself further. Essentially, reinforcing the concept of how becoming your own bank can liberate you mentally, physically, spiritually, to be able to grow as a human being. Because as we develop ourselves, as we continue to improve our perception of what it is the world around us and within us, we learn more about what it is that is our role outside of us. And so all of this is to say that if we can condense the lessons from one to another and we put them together in these videos, where we can essentially save each other time by condensing the most important lessons of what we've learned over, let's say, 365 days. We put it together in about 30 minutes. And then now we are sharing information that moves society forward and innovating the concepts or the perspectives that we each hold. Ultimately, that is the whole point of coming together. Whether it's a collective of men that come together to display to each other how it is that brotherhood can sustain itself, or it's a collective of individuals and like-minded minds who want to improve the world because we are fighting for the same cause or we are fighting the same enemy. And this morning was really, really eye-opening to me when I started to think about, the three types of people that really play a big role in my life. There's people that are there for me, there's people that are there for the cause that I'm after, and then there's people that are with me because they are against the same enemy. So when I started to think about this, or the same obstacle, or against the same thing, right? And we all stand together for a reason. You just got to define where each person lies. And so I really want you to think about that as we go through this and before we get started, because I want you to know that I'm here for you. I may not be able to individually affect each one of your lives, but there is a link where you can reach me. We could talk for about 30 minutes at no cost to you, all with the intention of clarifying what it is that you maybe understood about the subject matter that we're going to discuss, or more importantly, if you just have any questions that can maybe use my guidance. All right, so you have my time, you have my availability. All you got to do is click the link and we'll chop it up. But the most important thing here is that we address what's important here. Because over the last year, I've been able to really understand certain crises, issues, emergencies, crises that are really emerging throughout the world, that are innovating our technologies, because revolutionary minds with the knowledge to code already have been working diligently to innovate the entire infrastructure of what we consider the monetary system. The monetary system is currently suffering many, many instability issues, and more importantly, obstacles that it has to surpass in order to regain its stability. And so where I see this all going really starts with, once again, really addressing the main point of how do we allocate our hard-earned resources, wealth, into places where we can guarantee its long-term sustainability of value. Because as we can understand, inflation, or the loss of purchasing power of the unit of measurement that we use right now, it's a big concern. So what we're saying is that if you hold $1 today, what it's going to be its worth in the next 5 years. This is what we're talking about, because if you look at the current rate of inflation, they will tell you it's 1 to 4%. But in reality, we're looking at over 10% inflation. This is just what they're telling the public to keep things calm. But if you do the math yourself, we are looking at over 10%. And this is the thing. Once it's at over 10%, that means that every single year, $1 will lose its value 10%. That means that in 5 years, you will lose 50% of the purchasing price. As we keep going, you will start to see that the cost of products that a household needs will increase each year. And so because of this, we could take a look at what's called the CPI, which is an index of consumer products, which lets us know where it is that things are going. And so when we start to look at the CPI, one of the main things that we'll notice is that the CPI will start to increase drastically, which means that the cost per household to survive on is going to keep going up and up and up. So if individuals today, 5 years earlier, are not investing or researching or educating, they're going to be suffering, because they're going to be liable to being exposed to this deflation or inflation, which basically causes the price of goods to go up because the monetary system is so unstable. What causes this instability is the lack of a backing or a pegging of a dollar, right? So I needed to understand these things, because if I was going to proceed forward, understanding that food is our main thing that we got to worry about, right? It's the world's ability to produce what has allowed us to produce food at large scales. And it was back in the day when we discovered first that bat guano, or poop, was what helped us create the first levels of fertilizer, right? So we created fertilizer, which improved food production across the world. And so when there was a food production boom, This was a health boom, which means that now we had a population boom. And so now, because we had a population boom, we had to increase engineering and, more importantly, medicine. And so as all these things keep going up, we have to understand that each country is operating differently. Some countries move up faster than others. Some go green, green, green. Others go ahead and suffer in their economy because the availability of resources is not necessarily evenly distributed. And so what happens is, when we start to have certain countries that do acquire the proper resources to scale food production, that allows population to increase, which allows the households to increase the number of children that they're able to bear, because now they have more food, they have more wealth, they have more resources, which they can provide to the other countries that do not have them. And so this leads to these agreements between trade and commerce. And so going back to these agreements of trade and commerce, we have to look at how these agreements of trade and commerce have changed over the years in order to adapt to the technologies that are making the redistribution of resources available for us at major scales. We're talking about shipping, we're talking about ports, we're talking about transportation, we're talking about tracking of the paperwork, right? And all these things require what is called data. And all of this data has to be processed, and it has to be entered into a database in order to be processed. So this database, which essentially is going to house all the information of the world and how it's moving its economy around based upon the allocation of resources that they have established themselves for. Certain countries are known for certain things, right? And so when we start to say, hey, look, there's countries like China who depend on Australia for coal. And now when Australia is not doing deals with China for coal, this means China has to get it from somewhere else. And so if the price of this item goes up, because they could have gotten it from Australia for a cheaper price, but because they're not willing to trade, they have to get it from somewhere else at a higher cost. Now they're paying a higher cost to be able to produce electricity. And this is where everything is going. That as a world, we had to go ahead and have certain types of incentives to be able to produce or innovate technologies at a major scale in order to further global innovation or longevity. And so as we continue to increase these technologies that we are talking about, this is a negative cost. This is too much for China to pay. So they had to go ahead and create dams and different forms of electricity capturing mechanisms. This is where El Salvador comes in, where they start talking about turning geothermal energy into Bitcoin. Because it doesn't matter what type of energy you use, it doesn't matter, because what has to happen is you must have the new resource, which is called energy, plus a new resource called computers, in order to create a new currency called Bitcoin. Now we have to look at it at what is Bitcoin really doing, right? Because we have what is called the Bitcoin versus fiat, and we also have gold versus fiat. The problem here is not Bitcoin or gold, it's the people don't like fiat. People don't agree with the fiat money because it's essentially a brand of government money that is being imposed on the people by a military. And so when this happens, it's whoever has the biggest military, the most powerful military, that can essentially impose rules on the people. Now, in order to do trade and shipping and all these things, there had to be an agreement in the UN, and prior to that, it was through maritime law, where all these things started to be defined. Where maritime law allowed the creation of the UN through the Law of the Sea Convention, where all these things about what are resources and what are borders and parameters were all defined. And because all these things were all defined, now we have these three things being tied up. where it's immigration and the refugee crisis being brought together, because there are people in certain countries that are leaving their countries, trying to go to a better country, and they're in pursuit of prosperity, while you have the other people in certain countries where they're just trying to leave because of war, right? So one is hope, one is fear. And so now we have two different opposing issues, but they both need to be managed, because if you understand what is going on in America, the US has capitalized human life as assets. And so therefore, these assets need to be tracked and monitored. And so what's happening now is, as we continue to evolve into a new world of a computerized language, you, the user of these systems, have to understand that language determines the rules of the game, because they could either be talking about the real you, the sovereign you, or the you that has been capitalized against, right? The one that has been written in capital letters, that is meant to be used in language, in writing, in paperwork. It is meant to be used as a form of property that is created under a new system through the Vatican to establish what is called these bonds, based upon the idea that each life, depending upon its parents and its zip code and its upbringing, they have a formula where you can calculate the value of each individual based upon their level of education and so on. These things are what one can expect is what's given our current US dollar its actual underlying value or stability. It's not really something that the public understands. And so because the public doesn't understand the darkness of the US dollar, the world is currently looking to create its own decentralized monetary system. And as we continue to transition into these issues, they are trying to create a decentralized reserve currency based upon energy. And it's an unspoken decentralized reserve currency, because as you can see, there are two ways that we can acquire Bitcoin, right? We can either have energy coming from these natural producing or oil methods, where a lot of these companies that are currently running a lot of these mining computers, they're using oil to power the computers in order to go ahead and increase their yield of Bitcoin. But obviously, as the halving of Bitcoin comes around, and then I think it's going to be in the year 2140 that we're going to have all the Bitcoins produced. So imagine, by the year 2140, all 21 million Bitcoins will be produced. So therefore, it's no longer going to be the cost of energy to produce Bitcoins. Now, it's going to be running on a different source, right? Because we can expect that within the next 120 years, we are going to innovate our energy sources. And so therefore, right now, those that can earn the most Bitcoin are those that can spend the most money, because we are in an old system of oil in order to produce these systems. But we can understand that manpower is all it takes to acquire gold, manpower. Now, yes, there are more efficient ways which require machinery, but at the end of the day, all we need is manpower in order to acquire gold. And gold is a sustainable tool or hedge against the fiat monetary system. And what we're really discussing here is a rebalancing of the scales of trade. Because if we are looking at the scales of trade, which are telling us which country is above the others, right? We call these like the G7 countries, and they're involved with the Bank of International Settlements, and all these things that the BIS is doing is based upon the ability of the scales to determine which country is above the others. And so what we're talking about is which country has more power based upon the redistribution of wealth or resources. Going back to this, because what's currently going on, once again, is the resources to create what is called the fertilizer for the world. Most of that is found in the world. I believe it's over 40% of the world's potash is found in Morocco. And so what's happening now is that we will start to see a big shift towards the African continent The attention, right, is going towards Africa. Why? Because in order to build computers, you need minerals and crystals and all these other materials that can only be acquired from the earth or asteroids, which is why if we want to continue our current innovation of computers, and according to Moore's law, the innovation computing power should continue to double every year, right? And it should be exponentially where we were 100 years ago. But you see, they keep telling us that we are living with technology of the 1900s, and that is only because of the ignorance of our population not able to stand up for what they know is right. Because when we look at the history of the World's Fair, we understand that since the 1890s and 1900s, we had the technology to be able to create everything that we have today. So over the last 120 years, we have been lied to about what it is that we currently possess the technology to do, as they in the background have been developing. And so what's going on now is that as we are seeing all of these changes in technology, we have to innovate our ability to scale trade and commerce. And this is where smart contracts come in, because smart contracts are going to become the new scales, the new judges of how we determine the value of things and how we judge or execute these parameters of trade and shipping at an automated large-scale model, which now allows us to encapsulate the entire world trade and finance, which essentially is going to run right under TradeFinex. And TradeFinex is currently an application being built with XDC as its main token on the R3 Corda blockchain. Now we have to understand what is a blockchain, right? Because these blockchains, as we said, are forms of database in which the form of inputting the information is different than these type of databases, right? The type of storing information is different because the ability of doing so allows us to use smart contracts as objects which can which must abide by specific parameters that can be put together through the smart contract, which means those developers, those individuals who understand the language of code and interaction with computers through the syntax of what is called Solidity, the language of the Ethereum virtual machine, these individuals will be able to control either access, creation, development, funding, all these different layers of what is called the banking system or the financial system. Because a new decentralized financial system is being built through these financial technology companies who are earning so much money that they can essentially become their own banks. We're talking about the Amazon, we're talking about the Walmarts, we're talking about all these big companies that have acquired so much wealth in the old world that they can essentially compete with the current world financial banks, which are the central banks and such. And what's going on is there are certain companies that have acquired so much cash that they are now playing the role of becoming lenders. And as they continue to become lenders to the public, these are outside regulations of the government, because the government is used to the banks being financial institutions, but you have private technology companies coming in to redistribute the wealth and to allow others to come up. Yes, charging interest fees and all that stuff, but they also innovate the technology that's underlying at the bottom of things, because we have to move out of the legacy system and enter these new standards of programmable money. And that's what we're entering. This whole thing about being able to transition into a brand new international shipping standards of programmable money. And these are what's called the ISO 222 tokens, which are the 5 tokens, including QNT, so that makes it 6 tokens of insane value, because they are what is going to sustain the liquidity platforms for what we would consider trade and finance. Now, learning this, I had no choice but to bank on these tokens to progressively increase as the attention of the public is elsewhere. The development of these infrastructural tokens, I like to say the pipes in the water, all of this stuff is being built on the other side of the user's attention or the public's attention. And so because of this, we can see that the only way that they can go ahead and really position themselves in a place where there must be first a resetting of the scales, because currently there's too much debt in the world. And the only thing that can fix this is a gold revaluation. What this gold revaluation process would do is that it would give us a brand new method of, or ratio, of what gold would be measured as in the sense of currency fiat units. And so what we're looking at with this entire reset of these units, we would start to see a brand new understanding of how many US dollars would be for 1 ton or 1 ounce in US dollars. Now, this was done in the 1930s, and this was done in the 1970s, and it has been started in the 2000s, but it has not been finalized. And this is what we call the Basel regulations, right? So Basel regulations, these are occurring to guarantee that the banks that the Bank of International Standards works with, they have more gold to stop what is called the unallocated, where is that? Oh yeah, right here. Unallocated trading of metals. Because the balance sheets of the banks across the world are currently at a tipping point where we are too much in debt considering fiat to gold. And so the world has been preparing for this reset. But they're not telling us that. They're telling us the opposite, because they don't want you to know that there will be a gold reset. They actually, on the contrary, want you to go ahead and do what most individuals would do in a time like this, is that they would follow the crowd and enter the stock market without financial education, just like I did, and then expect to catch a wave. I've seen many friends that lose thousands of dollars. Even myself, I've lost thousands of dollars trying to go ahead and understand what it is that it means to play in the market, or play or invest in the market. And after an entire year, I've learned that it's not about investing without research. It's about understanding in your own way what it is that technology is leading us towards. Because as we become more educated on how the technology has been able to be innovated, determined by the pace of the world's fear or lack of faith in the fiat money that has been imposed on us since the 1913, when the Federal Reserve was created in the United States. And all of this is simply a structured plan which many civilizations have suffered victim to, of superinflation. And without education, we cannot foresee these things, which is what causes us to become more materialistic and dependent on materials, because they happen to take away our need through entertainment of educating ourselves. And by taking away that need of self-governance, we create this sense of dependency in the government, that in them we trust. Not in God we trust, but in the government we trust. Because most individuals don't have a proper sense of faith, either outside of themselves or within themselves. And what tends to happen is when one individual does not acquire wealth the way they were promised by faith, then they start to doubt their faith and they start to suffer financially. So when one starts to suffer financially and they lose their faith, they lose their health. And I want you to understand that this is the point of being able to take full advantage of those individuals that don't understand the balance between health and wealth. Because if you do not have a proper balance between your own health and your own wealth, then what tends to happen is you start to become dependent on these other vehicles for pleasure or joy or entertainment in order to make you feel better about your current situation, making you a consumer, not a producer. And so whenever you invest in crypto, you need to start thinking which companies are trying to produce for the social benefit of the entire world, meaning which are creating the most productive, disruptive, and innovating technologies. This all goes back to which teams have the best developers to put together the best smart contracts based upon their proven record of what they've achieved. So you don't want to invest into companies that have absolutely no developers or track record of what they're doing. Trust me, I did that. I entered a lot of positions just because I wanted to be early, and then I suffered the consequences. Teaching me a great lesson that if I am going to enter a position, it has to be done not with the pursuit of immediate profits, but in the belief and faith of the technology at hand, or the language that is going to be imposed, or parameters or law that is going to be imposed on individuals in order to be able to make the systems fair. Because yes, there are certain ecosystems that will limit you in order to only move around if you possess their token. But you also want to look at it at a bigger scale as how could you guarantee that your bloodline survives the next 100 and 200 years? Because if you're not thinking that way, then you're not thinking like the greats, and you're putting yourself in a position to mentally stress about your financial allocations. And so whenever we cover all these topics, it's all with the idea that if you start to invest into crypto, you don't just do it because of the trend, you do it because you understand that yes, there are technologies that have been built since the start of Bitcoin, but Bitcoin was simply a way for the public to start to break away or introduce. Maybe it was those, conspiracy theorist heads, if you want to believe that it was somebody introducing Bitcoin to the world in order to drive us towards a technocratic agenda. You could think that way, because we understand that a technocratic agenda has been the intention of the private bankers since the World's Fair in the 1900s. You see, you cannot believe that there is not two sides to every story. It's not just our history. You have to look at Russia's history. You have to look at China's and India's and every single country of the world, because if you don't understand why you believe what you believe, or why you've been told many lies throughout the years. And so you have to begin to deconstruct this entire paradigm of what they tell you that is life, and you have to step into your own paradigm or your own lifestyle and your own experiences and your own ethos, and you really got to redefine what it is that money means to you. Because to some, money means a way to access items and objects and experiences. To others, it's a way to guarantee mental stability, right? Because if you can guarantee your mental stability, you can use your 24 hours with more enthusiasm, and you can then perform better in every situation, knowing that there is no lack in your life. However, whenever your allocation of wealth is reserved in a financial institution such as a bank, you are liable to always lose control of that, because they are the ones managing your resources. And this goes back to self-governing your own mind, your own resources, your own energy, your own thoughts, and your own ideas. All of this, sure, a lot of these actions will be captured through transactions, which will end up on the blockchain. But what is yours, and you need to learn to protect it. And this is why intellectual property law is so important, and why contract law is so important for you to learn. Because if you enter these experiences of trade and commerce without the understanding that every interaction has an underlying syntax or an underwritten kind of subtext explanation to each word that you speak. And so when we talk about the idea of what we're creating here, these are artificial. Once again, since the 1900s, we've transitioned our nations into artificial corporations in order to create liabilities and assets or products out of individuals themselves, in which laws or the civil code was used to impose parameters of operation under those countries which are being ran by this monetary system that was imposed by military. So therefore, the most important funding of every single monetary system has to be military. And if these military technologies don't develop ahead of the current technological debates at the public's ears, then how would the military sustain its technological advantage down the years? You have to start thinking about this with a bigger mindset than what the public is being fed, because if you don't, you're being susceptible to falling victim to this. And I'm telling you only what I know, because the price of each company's value at the current price of the stock market per value, if the price per earnings isn't matching up, a lot of these companies do not make sense. And so what we have to do is, could we get upset about the lack of judgment in these companies and the price? We can't. But what we could say is that we could look hard at what could be done about this to bring balance to the scales, which is the gold reevaluation. This would be the biggest reset that I've been saying, where if you right now price one, I think it was 48 to 50K, I don't remember exact price of gold, last time I checked is around here, so 1 ton of gold. So if 1 ton of gold costs this much, well, the moment that they reevaluate this to now be, let's say, 200K, every single bank that holds at least 1 ton of US dollars to gold, right? The gold goes up in price because they were reevaluated, which means the amount of currency units to each ounce of gold or ton of gold will increase. And now if it's 4x, that means the balance sheet of the banks will 4x as well. And so now they can justify the amount of liquidity in current circulation backing the US dollar. This would bring a lot of balance to the scales. Therefore, all the individuals currently holding gold at this current value would benefit from that reset, because then they could either resell the gold back for dollars in order to survive, or they can now go ahead and understand that they have built a substantial amount of layer or protection in their capital allocation through these metals. And so this rebalancing of the scales would bring not only judgment, or it would give birth to the ISO tokens, because now there is a stable pricing to the dollar. And this is why we're saying, even though the US is moving slow from what you think is going on, there is a lot of understanding about all of this, which is why China and the US are fighting currently for Taiwan. Because back in, I believe it was the 40 to the 49, in 1940s and 1949, China had its revolution where its leader ended up leaving to Taiwan with all the gold and leaving it in Taiwan and establishing its own country and its own, because it not only does it have its own natural resources, but now it has its own country's gold, and therefore they are stable or sustainable on their own should the entire world economy suffer. It doesn't matter. Now, why is this so important? Well, China has been mining gold for the last 8,000 years. So 8,000 years compared to the US's, let's say 170, 200 years of history, it doesn't compare. There's so much more depth in China's vaults of gold. And so as we continue to see this game that's being played, you have to understand that China is going from 1949 to 2049. This is their game. This is their 100-year celebration. And so as we all take part in this agenda of theirs, where we go ahead and play the game of the green mask, where they want to convince us that we are moving towards what is called a green revolution, because there are many secrets of the world that we are not supposed to know about. And so the more that we can go ahead and create a financial system that is more stable, but will still allow for the encryption of messages and the movement of financial assets with privacy. And you have to realize that all that we're discussing here is how to move resources and how to track resources, even if that means human beings, because what's happening is the fourth industrial revolution is taking advantage of the fact that every 20 years, there is a huge gap in technological education. And so as the, let's say, boomers, I'm going to go ahead and finish here. So as we continue to see that these generations that came before us, right, we had the 60s, the 80s, the 20s, the 2000s, and now we have the 2020. And so what's happening here is when we started talking about the flowers, right? This is consciousness. This is hippies. This is their pursuit or attempt to increase consciousness through these substances. But they determined that these substances were to be regulated. And so what happened was, now we have these guys who are not only fighting for civil rights, but developing technology using these substances, such as acid, to create a computer and codes. And this is where everything starts to transition, because not only is the law changing, but we are creating these ideas of politics where we are now going into this next layer, which is individual rights. And then now what we're transitioning to is community rights. And so as we start seeing these trends change, we start going from our attempt at increasing our personal awareness at an individual level, but the government said that these substances need to be regulated because the increasing of an individual's consciousness would cause disruption of the standard quo or the status quo. And so now we have the civil rights where individuals want to be fighting for their rights, which is totally fine because once again, we raised our consciousness. Once we did raise our consciousness, we realized that blacks and whites did not need to be fighting because we are all one. We are all one. There are people that stood for that and there are people that didn't. Those that did went one direction. Those that didn't went the other direction. And then you start to see why individual rights became so important. And as we start to proceed, we have what's called social media and the internet, right? So internet was here. Because, I'm sorry, this is PCs. This is internet, social media, which is Web 2.0, right? Because now, this here was when DARPA developed the internet, right? So we have the 60 PCs, boom, coding. This is scale. I'm sorry, internet. This is internet with DARPA. And then this is the internet, social internet at scale, because now we have computer production being available to everybody. And then now that computers are available to everybody, we can transition into what is called Web 3.0. But now here's the biggest question of identity ownership. This is the question that is being imposed on us right now, because how do you transition individual rights into an identity or asset ownership when what's going on is that community rights are being determined by what is called the green agenda, which is essentially leading us towards a world where carbon credits and carbon emissions lead the way. And if you can start to understand that it's these individuals who think with the global benefit in mind, moving to create what are called these algorithms. Algorithms are another way of saying gods, which control these parameters or laws, which is another way of saying God. God is laws, laws of the universe. God controls it all, right? So we don't have this, we have to use a word to describe what is this parameters, which is the structure for material world to follow. But now we are going into digital world as well. And so because we have developed our language, we have now created a symbiotic relationship through language with computers. And so now we can go ahead and depend on these items here to lead us towards a brand new world from 2030 to 2050. Now, who's going to be ahead in these days is really dependent upon the great cycle. All right, so we have what's called the great cycle coming ahead of us. So the great cycle is what's going to determine, obviously, automation and scale because of what we call enlightenment. But what happens is those that understand, they are planning and using satellites to scan world events. And the idea here is when you can track all the resources of the world, you can play a big role in moving resources around, as this great year plays a big effect on our climate. Going back to the climate issue that we're suffering, because they want to tell us that our health will continue to suffer because of the virus, but the virus was actually introduced into society as a way to bring health into the scales of what determines dependency for medical innovation. Medical innovation is going to be happening because we have to have a transition from what is called, I'm sorry, I just looked, but it's basically what we're looking at, natural organs, right? So we have organs that are natural or synthetic organs. And the only way that we could do this is if we had a global emergency where, due to these things, there was a lot of heart disease or issues where we had no choice but basically surrender our health in order to get a new heart. And this new heart will put you in debt. And this debt would be why you work, because you don't care to work as long as you have a new heart. And those individuals that did not go ahead and go through this are essentially the only ones that are able to control their own natural heart pulse, dilation, or heart rate. Everybody else has been affected. And so what they're trying to do is this is the new type of war where you destroy a country's health through either frequencies, virus, or technology dependency. And what happens is you monetize this as the new form of attention, because attention goes where health lacks. Attention goes where health lacks. And you need to understand that this is the great game that we are playing, because the less that you understand how to actually fabricate, manifest your own health and reconstruct yourself from within, the more dependency you'll have within the system, because the system has what is called technological innovations that will sustain your birth or your longevity. So think about how this cycle of imposing these laws and these technological advancements through these false chemicals, which are being used to create these forms of fertilizer or false foods, right? Because false foods will also deter your health. But if they're telling you that there is a climate change, then you're more likely to buy into these type of detrimental actions, which will counteract all the good that you've done your entire life, giving up all your resources to those that don't need it but want them. And so now you start to think about your future legacy and your bloodline, and you start to realize that unless you do something about it, unless you continue to raise your own personal consciousness, then you're not going to be able to achieve what is needed for you to be a free, sovereign being. And it all goes back to the language. And so when you start to understand that all of this is currently happening because of a major instability for the depth of understanding the contracts that we enter. And a lot of these contracts are being now forced on us, because if you want to use the latest technology, you have to abide by these contracts. And if you're willing to go ahead and do so in an objective matter, where it's not a negotiation anymore, but it's just simply yes or no access, I submit to these rules or no access. Either you get left behind in the technology and you become one of those boomers. Because if you're not keeping up with the technology, you're being left behind. And every 20 years, technology is moving so fast ahead that those in control of the regulations are not able to fully comprehend the innovations. And so you have to be right in the middle of the two to understand regulatory clarity, and you got to understand disruptive technologies to be able to position yourself in a way where your financial allocations can actually multiply or appreciate over the next few days, instead of succumbing to that 10% inflation rate that we were talking about and you losing the purchasing power of your assets. So as we continue to go on to this next year, 2022, we want to make sure that you understand all of these things that are going on, because this is the precedent on which we're going to go ahead and build every single video from here on out. So make sure you subscribe, make sure you check us out, make sure you watch all the previous content. It's going to be a lot of rants and a lot of random information that will probably give you a more open perspective of what it is to get involved with the financial system, as well as the stock market, as well as if you're an athlete trying to transition into a different lifestyle. Remember, the only way to be able to become the best athlete is to have absolutely no financial concerns, or no housing concerns, no food concerns. And being able to educate yourself on how to allocate your wealth to the proper investment vehicles to maximize your returns and eventually free yourself is the only goal. Speaking personally, being able to create passive income has given me the chance to help many, myself, my family members, and those that I love around me, because at the end of the day, it's knowledge that we're going to leave behind, memories that are created through the eye-opening experiences that we share by igniting neurons within each other. So I hope that this has helped you achieve some kind of enlightenment within your own self, and we'll see you on the next one.